What once sounded like fantasy inside the Dallas Cowboys war room is quietly becoming one of the most intriguing draft scenarios of 2026. Caleb Downs, long projected as a top 10 lock, is now drifting into a range where Dallas doesn't just observe, they act. And that subtle shift changes everything. Because in the NFL draft, value isn't just about talent. It's about timing, positional perception, and organizational conviction. Downs hasn't changed. The league's perception of him has. For months, the narrative around Downs was simple: elite prospect, top-tier safety, inevitable early selection. But the closer the draft gets, the more the league starts to reveal its true evaluation patterns. And history is clear: safeties, no matter how talented, rarely command universal top 10 respect. That disconnect between talent grade and draft position is where opportunity is born. And Dallas, sitting at number 12, suddenly finds itself in that exact window. Daniel Jeremiah's recent comments didn't just challenge expectations. They exposed a deeper truth about how NFL teams think. While fans and analysts often rank players purely on ability, front offices weigh positional value, roster construction, and long-term financial implications. The safety position, fairly or not, continues to be treated as a luxury rather than a cornerstone. That perception alone can push elite prospects down the board. This is where the Cowboys' situation becomes particularly interesting. Unlike teams drafting ahead of them, Dallas isn't just looking for best player available. They're navigating a roster that already carries heavy financial commitments. That forces them to be selective, strategic, and, at times, opportunistic. If a top 10 talent falls into their lap at number 12, the equation shifts from planning to reacting. The recent free agency additions of Jalen Thompson and P.J. Locke might suggest that the Cowboys have addressed their secondary. But in reality, those moves feel more like stabilization than transformation. They provide depth, flexibility, and insurance, not necessarily elite playmaking. And that distinction matters when evaluating whether a player like Downs becomes a priority. Because Downs isn't just another safety prospect. He represents a different type of defensive chess piece. One that can blur roles, disguise coverages, and impact multiple layers of the field. In today's NFL, where offenses are designed to exploit predictability, that kind of versatility carries significant strategic value. But again, the league doesn't always price that value correctly. So the real question isn't whether Caleb Downs is talented enough for the top 10. It's whether the NFL, as a system, is willing to treat his position with the same urgency as edge rushers, quarterbacks, or tackles. And if the answer is no, even partially, then the Cowboys aren't just spectators in this scenario. They're potential beneficiaries of the league's own hesitation. There's a pattern in the NFL draft that refuses to disappear, no matter how the game evolves. Safeties, even the elite ones, continue to slide further than expected. It happened with Derwin James. It happened with Kyle Hamilton. And now, all signs suggest Caleb Downs could follow the same path. This isn't coincidence. It's structural bias within how teams assign value to positions. Front offices often justify this by pointing to positional impact. Quarterbacks change franchises. Edge rushers disrupt entire offensive systems. Offensive tackles protect long-term investments. Safeties, on the other hand, are often viewed as complementary, important, but not foundational. Even when that logic doesn't hold up on film, it still drives draft decisions. Daniel Jeremiah's analysis reinforces this reality. When he says the safety position is tricky, he's not questioning talent. He's acknowledging how teams think. Downs may be a top 10 player on his board, but that doesn't guarantee a top 10 selection. Because draft boards inside NFL buildings don't always mirror public rankings. They reflect philosophy, not just evaluation. And then there are the physical metrics, the quiet filters that shape perception. Downs is slightly under 6 feet, just over 200 pounds, with shorter arms than ideal prototypes. In a league that increasingly leans on measurable traits, those details matter. Not because they define his ability, but because they introduce hesitation in rooms where risk tolerance is limited. Another factor working against safeties is the concept of splash plays. Interceptions, forced fumbles, highlight moments. These often elevate defensive prospects in the eyes of decision-makers. Downs, while highly instinctive and consistent, doesn't rely on flashy production. His game is built on anticipation, positioning, and control. Ironically, those are traits that win games but don't always win draft hype. This creates a paradox. The very qualities that make Downs a reliable, high-level player may be the same ones that cause teams to hesitate. He's not a projection, he's a processor. And in a draft culture that often chases upside over certainty, that can be undervalued, especially at a position already fighting for recognition. So when Jeremiah suggests Downs is more likely to land between picks 10 and 20, it's not a critique. It's a reflection of systemic tendencies. The league isn't questioning whether he's good. It's questioning whether his position deserves that level of investment. And that subtle distinction is exactly where the Cowboys' opportunity begins to take shape. For the Cowboys, this isn't just about adding talent. It's about defining identity. Over the past few seasons, Dallas has built a defense centered around aggression, speed, and disruption. But there's been a missing layer, a true field general in the secondary who can connect the front and back ends of the defense. That's where a player like Caleb Downs enters the conversation. The current structure of the Cowboys' secondary offers stability but lacks a defining presence. The additions of Thompson and Locke provide versatility, but neither projects as a long-term centerpiece. They are functional pieces in a system, not necessarily the player you build around. And that distinction becomes critical when facing elite offenses in high-stakes moments. Modern NFL offenses are designed to stress defenses horizontally and vertically at the same time. That requires safeties who can process quickly, adjust on the fly, and eliminate space before it becomes exploitable. Downs fits that mold. His ability to operate near the line of scrimmage while still having the range to cover deep zones gives coordinators flexibility that few players can offer. But drafting Downs would also signal something deeper, a philosophical commitment. It would mean the Cowboys are willing to challenge the league's conventional valuation of the safety position. Instead of following the trend, they would be betting on impact over perception. And that's not a small decision for a franchise under constant scrutiny. There's also the financial layer to consider. Elite safeties on rookie contracts can provide tremendous value relative to veteran deals at other positions. If Downs develops into a high-level starter, Dallas would control that production at a fraction of the cost compared to free agency. In a cap-driven league, those margins matter more than ever. However, the risk isn't negligible. If the league is undervaluing safeties for structural reasons, then investing a premium pick in one requires conviction. It means believing that your internal evaluation is stronger than the collective market. And historically, that's where teams either gain an edge or make costly mistakes. So the Cowboys aren't just evaluating Caleb Downs the player. They're evaluating Caleb Downs the decision. The ripple effects of that choice would extend beyond the draft, shaping defensive schemes, financial planning, and even how the organization is perceived in terms of roster-building philosophy. One of the most fascinating aspects of Caleb Downs' draft story is the tension between what he is and what teams want him to be. On film, he's a highly instinctive, versatile defender capable of impacting multiple phases of the game. But in draft rooms, the conversation often shifts from performance to projection. And that's where things become complicated. Downs excels in controlled chaos. He reads plays quickly, positions himself efficiently, and rarely takes unnecessary risks. These are traits that translate well to the NFL, particularly in complex defensive systems. But they don't always fit neatly into predefined archetypes. He's not the prototypical deep safety. He's not purely a box defender. He exists somewhere in between. That hybrid identity can be both a strength and a challenge. Teams that value versatility will see Downs as a solution. Teams that prefer clearly defined roles may see him as a question mark. And in the draft, ambiguity often leads to hesitation. Not because the player lacks ability, but because he requires a vision to unlock his full potential. Rob Gregson's scouting perspective highlights this perfectly. Downs has the speed and instincts to cover wide areas of the field, yet he may do his best work closer to the line of scrimmage. That duality is rare, but it demands patience. Teams must be willing to experiment, adjust, and build around his skill set rather than forcing him into a rigid system. In many ways, Downs represents the modern evolution of the safety position. The game is no longer about static roles, it's about adaptability. Defenses need players who can disguise intentions, rotate coverage, and react in real time. Downs offers that toolkit. But again, not every team is equipped to maximize it. This brings us back to Dallas. The Cowboys have shown flashes of creativity in their defensive schemes, but consistency has been an issue. Integrating a player like Downs would require a clear plan, not just talent acquisition. It would mean committing to a system that leverages his strengths rather than exposing his limitations. So the debate isn't just about where Downs will be drafted. It's about which team is prepared to use him correctly. Because in the NFL, the difference between a good player and a great one often comes down to context. And for Caleb Downs, context may be everything. As the draft approaches, the possibility of Caleb Downs reaching pick number 12 is no longer hypothetical. It's plausible. And if that scenario unfolds, the Cowboys will face one of the most defining decisions of their offseason. Not because Downs is a perfect prospect, but because of what selecting him would represent. This is where opportunity meets identity. If Dallas passes on Downs, they're aligning with the league's traditional valuation of the safety position. They're choosing predictability, perhaps addressing other needs that carry more conventional weight. But if they select him, they're making a statement, one that challenges the status quo. The consequences of that decision will extend beyond immediate performance. Draft picks shape narratives. They influence how fans, analysts, and even players perceive an organization. Taking Downs could signal a shift toward a more progressive, adaptable defensive philosophy. Passing on him could reinforce a more conservative approach. There's also the competitive landscape to consider. In a conference loaded with dynamic offenses, the margin for defensive error is shrinking. Teams that fail to evolve risk being exposed. A player like Downs doesn't just fill a position, he expands possibilities. He allows defenses to respond rather than react. But the draft is never just about logic. It's about timing, conviction, and sometimes risk tolerance. The Cowboys must decide whether they trust their evaluation enough to go against the grain. Because if Downs becomes the player many believe he can be, passing on him won't just be a missed opportunity, it will be a defining regret. And that's the real story here. Not whether Caleb Downs is a top 10 talent. Not whether safeties are undervalued. But whether the Dallas Cowboys are willing to see what others don't and act on it. Because in the NFL, the difference between contenders and pretenders often comes down to moments exactly like this. The board will fall. The names will be called. And somewhere between picks 10 and 12, a decision will be made that could quietly reshape the future of a franchise.